I want to talk about undersea cables and what they are. They're this vast network that span the world. Now, today you have about 700,000 nautical miles of fiber optic cables, which transmit over $10 trillion worth of financial transactions every day, private communications, military, intelligence. Now, undersea cables, a lot of people think that the internet is carried by satellites. I mean, this is a bit of a product of Hollywood in the 1980s and 1990s. Now, satellites are very important, and they're going to become even more important in the world that we're moving into. But the undersea cable, that fiber optic cable, carries somewhere between 90 and 95% of the traffic that I described. And of course, America dominates when it comes to that transmission of that data. And probably about 70 or 75% of traffic, what you're looking at on your smartphone on a given day when you call up information, that's passing through the US in some form or another for most of its journey, other than the sort of short final part. And a lot of it passes through Virginia, located relatively close for some bizarre reason to the heart of American power and intelligence networks. So what are those cables? Those are fiber optic cables. That's glass or plastic. It's carrying light encoded with data, which then at the other end is decoded and then turns into images. But this is images or text or video. This is new technology. Before fiber optic cables, there was something else, the origin of this story, and that was the telegraph cable, the undersea submarine cable of the 19th century. When the first cable is laid between the US and the UK, it has this extraordinary effect on human communication. Think of a world in which before this, it takes about 10 to 12 days for information to travel across the Atlantic to London or to Paris or to another European capital by letter and carried by ship, of course. In 1865, when Lincoln is assassinated, it takes 12 days for the news to reach London and Paris. You move within a couple of years to a situation where that news can travel across the Atlantic in 10 hours, then as the system improves, then kind of 10 minutes, and then eventually 10 seconds. This is, I would argue, a revolution of the imagination. It changes our conceptions as human beings of time and distance. We feel it today in the smartphone, but where did it come from? And what lessons are there from the 19th century as we're now in a new age of innovation and technological competition? Slow information or slow transfer of information had long been a problem for rulers and for military commanders. I mean, how could the center communicate, send information about troop deployments, supply over long distances when you had the horse, or latterly you had the carrier pigeon? The French were very proud of this and invented a semaphore system during the revolutionary period when they wanted to try and keep track of what was going on inside revolutionary France, but it was a mechanical wooden thing with posts sort of built across the country and then really eliminated by the next wave of innovation. And it's electricity. Electricity, or this wave of theorizing and thinking about electricity in the early 19th century, that changes absolutely everything. So you get the overland telegraph in the 1830s and the 1840s, the first channel link in 1851 between the UK and France. This is a really simple cable, which is just copper wrapped in gum, coming from Malaysia. So you can see there's an imperial connection, which I'll come to again in a moment. But the real prize was linking up the UK and the US. They try in 1857 and 1858, the USS Niagara, and then the appropriately named HMS Agamemnon are put to work. They link up, and there's huge celebration. The first message, the successful message that is transmitted, is by President Buchanan and Queen Victoria. Disaster, the cable then breaks after only 2 weeks. And here you get to a really important high Victorian part of the story, which is you have a public inquiry. The Brits are so embarrassed that the cable has failed after all of that hoopla that there is an inquiry, a public inquiry in which all of the information is aired and blame is apportioned, but lessons are then learned. Interestingly, the blame goes to the most fantastically named man in the whole story, which is Edward Orange Wildman Whitehouse, who's a surgeon in the UK, but he, I was going to say he's an amateur engineer, but he's probably an amateur surgeon as well. But he's an amateur engineer. And then in steps the hero, William Thomson, who's later Lord Kelvin, arguably the most significant scientist of the 19th century. He's part of that original effort, but no one listened to him. And then by the time you get to 1865, 1866, people are listening to him. He is in charge. And he works out that what's needed is obviously thicker cable, better insulation, but also something called the mirror galvanometer, which can amplify the signal, the weak signal. And it works. So in 1865 and 1866, you have success. It's not cheap, this. Not like everyone is sending around signals, beaming them around the world. It costs the equivalent of several months of earnings to send one message. But the market does its fantastic thing of putting down more of this cable, speeding it up, it becomes cheaper, all sorts of things then become possible. The futures market, tradable information, the futures markets in the modern sense are arguably created by this process of people swapping information between markets. Note at this point that it was not a centrally planned state initiative. Right? This is private individuals, investors, scientists, rogues, adventurers, interesting people doing this. But then what happens after the 1860s is that the British state wakes up to the potential for this, and the British state co-opts it. You can see the potential in terms of diplomatic telegrams, coded intelligence, and then eventually intelligence spying on other people's cables. The network grows, it starts to span the world. Other rival nations, like the French, put down their own cables, but the British had a head start because they'd moved first, and as their empire grows, they have more of an incentive to do it. Now, that British head start, then technological advantage, has an enormous impact in the First World War and in the Second World War. It means that the British begin with the advantage of more reliable communications. You see that in the Zimmermann telegram in 1917, where the Brits intercept a German cable, and then the Brits have to pretend and create a cover story, all very British, that they hadn't intercepted it, and get it to the Americans and say, look, the Germans are trying to do a deal with Mexico to give Texas and Arizona and New Mexico back to Mexico. And the Americans are furious, and it's a contributory factor when America then declares war on Germany. But it was, after the Second World War, it was thought for a while, because of course radio had happened, and it was almost as though radio was going to take over, undersea cables would disappear. But that's not what happened. The undersea cable is completely reinvented and reinvigorated because of the internet and that fiber optic cable. And this is American technological advantage. It means that the network carries the internet. It's on the same routes very often, and it's sort of laid in a similar way. It's new boats, new technology, but still the principle is the same. And that today is critical infrastructure that needs defending. I mean, you see stories about this almost every single week. You know, the Houthis cut 3 cables, and with the Red Sea cable cut, that hits about 25% of traffic in Europe and disrupts and slows things down. So there is this constant battle that we're in to deter and combat. And we don't these attacks from the autocrats, and we don't at the moment even particularly have enough of the infrastructure. There's a shortage of the ships. which can go down, which can repair, find the breaks and repair. So we have to do more on that front. But I just wanted to draw some lessons and in terms of markets and innovation and how it works from that 19th century story through the 20th century, through the Brits and the Americans. The first lesson, number one, is that the best innovation happens within a framework of robust and free institutions, the rule of law, property rights, capital, markets. And that's more than just an abstract institutional point. It's about human behavior. Because what that means is that you have the freedom to be wrong. You have the freedom to experiment. And in the case of Kelvin and what happened in that inquiry in 1861, that impetus to find the truth openly in public, fully reported, and to then try and construct a series of recommendations which push towards progress and then lead to success, that's absolutely at the heart of it and at the heart of the Victorian idea. Okay, they were rather cruel to our friend Edward Wildman Whitehouse, and actually Thompson defended him in the public inquiry. And this was public inquiry was great sort of front page news in the UK. But the point is that they had that open inquiry, and it led to improvement. Second point is that the interplay between government and the innovative market is really complex. And it's not simple enough to just say, it's all about private innovation. I'm a pro-market person, I'm a free market person, but it is foolish to say that the state then doesn't play a role. In the 19th century, it's about private innovation and private enterprise, then co-opted later by the state for imperial ends, by the British. But then there's a different story when the American state has been created, the modern state, and that's the story of the Manhattan Project in the 1940s through to DARPA, where essentially the Americans invented, American scientists and universities, funded by the American taxpayer, invented the modern economy and invented so much of what we take for granted today. It made the modern economy. So there's an example of the state and helping to drive private innovation. So the key thing is you have to have that private innovation, you have to have that freedom, but we also need a smart, innovative, fleet-of-foot state. Now, the great Daniel Hedrick, third conclusion to draw, I think, the great Daniel Hedrick, who wrote Invisible Weapon, which in the early 90s was a book about the undersea cable revolution. Now, he's writing it when it looks as though undersea cables are about to be kind of lose the information battle and be replaced by satellites, and the internet is only really just is only starting. He laments that something which started as a peaceful great mission, as they saw it in the Victorian era, for nation to speak unto nation through the undersea cable, had become, he regrets this, an instrument of war and subterfuge. To which I would say, well, that's history for you. And there isn't really any way around that. As long as there are autocrats who keep emerging, who need combating, you have to win the technological race. And it automatically has a defense and security component. So now we have to, as we think about the next 50 years, we have to maintain our technological advantage. Because, as the British example shows, a technological advantage now is an advantage in grand strategy 50 to 100 years later. And from William Thomson and his undersea cable, we can, I think, draw some modest inspiration. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Iain. I learned the other day that there is an International Cable Protection Committee founded in 1958 with companies as members, but also a few governments. And I looked through the membership list, and there are a fair number of Chinese companies being members of that committee. There are no Russian companies there, and the Russian state is not a member. What may be the reason for that?
We're going to hear from my friend Sergei about Russian or Soviet innovation. So maybe there's an explanation in there about why Russia was slow on it. I mean, I think one of the most interesting things about the whole cable experience is it does blaze a trail for international cooperation. And that's the other thing which happens in the 1870s and 1880s. The British and the French and various other states do collaborate on establishing international protocols. And that is born from that process I described of them regarding this as a peaceful venture. But that's then disrupted by war, and the cables become, as I said, an instrument of war. But you raise an interesting point about China. It's obviously plugged into so much of our technology, and I think it raises interesting questions about how we're going to have to carve out a space between allies where we can trust each other, share our technology, but not be open to sabotage by the autocrats.
Okay, precisely. Thank you very much.